Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Betty. Oh no, it's Belinda! Oh, it's Belinda! Oh, it's Belinda! Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha. This is a song about a guy, about Betty. My name's not Betty. Your name is Betty. And another girl who's also named Betty. I'm not Betty. Yes, you are. You're Betty. And we two cool guys, not Knuckles and Yoshi, but Bertha and Belinda. And this is our song. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Puppy, Betty, 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 Bertha. Oh no, it's Belinda. It's Belinda. Oh no, it's Belinda. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha. I want to sing. You can't sing. I want to sing though. You can't sing though, because it's my song. But I want to sing. No, you can't. Yes, I can. No, you can't. Yes, I can. I am Shadow, and I hate life. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha, Betty, 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 Betty. I said beta. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha. Well, we were playing boxing with these two chumps, and we kicked their butts. So that's just why we call them Betty. Stop calling us Betty. I can call you whatever I want. No, you can't. Yes, I can. I beat you in boxing. No, Yoshi beat me in boxing. Well, he wants you to be called Betty. Don't you, Yoshi? I want you to be called Betty. I hate you. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha. Oh no, it's Belinda. Ooh, it's Belinda. Betty, 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 Bertha, Bertha. You lost racing. No.